one moment he's telling Solomon, follow God all the days of your life and don't depart from a jot or tittle of the
Mm.
law and of the virtuous ways of God. And the next thing, he puts a hit out on one of his old enemies, right?
Yeah.
And he's like, he goes from sort of this pious, kind of reverent kind of worship leader to this, mafia don,
Right.
basically, right? That's all in one breath. And the Bible doesn't flinch from portraying
Yeah.
these two sides of David
Mm.
right from beginning to end. And
Hey guys, I just released my brand new book called The Lies That Bind, and I'd love to send you the first 2 chapters totally free. It's a book all about the lies and half-truths we believe that keep us from experiencing the incredible life that Jesus offers. And if you'd like those first 2 chapters sent, all you gotta do is go to testwithtruth.com and sign up. Well, welcome to the True North podcast. We are so excited today. We have a very special guest with us. His name is Mark Buchanan. And if you have been anywhere near a church or a bookstore in the last 20 years, you will recognize that name. Mark has authored countless books. Some of them have been incredibly well read and inspiring. The first of which I had a real impact on my life. Your God is Too Safe, Mark, was a remarkable book. And so many others that you've written since then have kind of shaped and molded both my and many people in my generation's understanding of the church. So we're so appreciative of you taking time to be here with us, and welcome to the podcast.
thanks, Chris. Really glad to be here.
So you are coming to us all the way from the west coast of Canada, aren't you, Mark?
Well, actually, today I'm coming all the way from the Rocky Mountains. I go between the
Wow.
West Coast and a little community just right near the Rockies. So I'm in that little community in Alberta right now.
It's a hard life, but someone's got to do it, right?
Indeed.
You were skiing this weekend at Revelstoke, you were mentioning as we were talking just before.
Right. Yeah. So I drove the 4 and a bit hours to Revelstoke. I have a son who lives there, and he's moved there because of the skiing at Mount
Mm.
Revelstoke. So I got in a great day there.
And you had a history of athletics, even. You even
Not
considered going.
athletics. I'm actually really I failed and floundered at virtually any sport, any team sport. I just
Okay.
didn't have the coordination. Somehow the magic was all there for skiing, and I
Mm.
started at 12, so that means I've been skiing 50 years.
Wow.
And I was it was like I was born to put those slats on my feet.
Very, very cool. I've been to Revelstoke only once. We were in a band traveling through, and it was honestly one of the most beautiful single spots I've ever seen in my life. Just nestled in the mountains, gorgeous sunrise, sunsets. Yeah, absolutely beautiful place.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. And actually, it's only really been discovered in the last 5 or so years. And of course, real estate prices in BC are
Mm.
dreadful, and that's one of the most expensive towns now, which never used to be the case up until a few years ago.
There's almost nowhere in this country to find a reasonable piece of land. So,
It's sad, yeah.
yeah, it really, really is. Yeah. So I'm really excited about your new book series here. You wrote at least the first 2 pieces of a trilogy on David. The first book was called David Rise, right? And your
Yeah.
second one is either just about to come out or just came
It,
out.
it, it just the Kindle version just released today,
Okay.
and the print version will be out in about 2 weeks.
And this is really exciting for you because this is a departure from even just the nonfiction that you've been writing for many years. This is actually what would you call it, historical fiction series or?
Yeah, it is. And so for it's actually a return, Chris. I began my writing career as a short story writer.
Hmm.
So I was writing fiction, and then when I got into book length treatments of subjects, I ended up writing nonfiction. And so it always had been my desire and plan to return to writing fiction. So this is the debut, this David series, and then maybe we'll have an opportunity to talk a bit later about another fiction piece that I'm partway through.
Oh, very cool. I got to thinking about what that must be like to prepare for a series like that, for a character like David. Like David, perhaps more than any other character in the Bible, is one of the most colorful and dynamic larger than life characters that come through
Yeah.
in the pages of Scripture. And in so many ways, he's a contradiction, a walking, living contradiction in sorts. He's the warrior poet, he's King David, he's humble at other moments, and then he's also the adulterer, the murderer. I was really curious as you were preparing for this series, how did you get ready for it? How do you immerse yourself? I remember watching this piece on the newest Elvis movie that came out, and some of the method acting in preparation for those characters is they spent 2 years inhabiting the person, just cutting off contact, moving away from home, and living in that world. What did you do to try and familiarize yourself with David enough that you might be able to think and write and kind of fill in the blanks?
It really began when I first came to faith at 21, so 40 some years ago. And I didn't even know the word mentor then, but I felt the deep need for my life to have people living or dead in it that would influence and guide me in terms of a life of faith. And I stumbled on two people scripturally, one the Apostle Paul and the second David,
Mm,
and sort of made them honorary mentors for me,
mm,
and just decided I was going to be a lifetime student of those two people especially, and really learn not simply from what was beautiful and virtuous and admirable about them, but where I might take heed or take warning. And there's more to take heed and warning from David's story than maybe Paul's. But so I started to immerse and steep myself in the David story 40 years back. The preparation to write the book is I had, at the point when I really began to conceive of this series of books, I was a pastor. I'm currently a professor, but I was um, really wanting to preach the story of David and do it in a way that wasn't hagiography or kind of like a portrait of a saint.
mm,
I really wanted to understand his humanity, the ways he wrestled with his own relationship with God, but especially what we see in David is wrestling with human relationships.
mm,
He's not a great husband. He has, as far as we can tell, one friend. The friend becomes exemplary, or that friendship exemplary, and kind of a model, for the rest of humanity about how to do friendship. But he only has one of them.
mm,
And everyone else seems to be a lackey, a toady, a rival, something, but not a friend. There's tensions, profound tensions that the story of David
mm,
indicates existed between him and his wives, him and his sons, him and his, people like Joab, his nephew slash henchman. And so I really wanted to do justice to this man after God's own heart, as he's come to know, but
mm,
who's so profoundly flawed and deeply, deeply human. I think, more than anything, drawn to the humanity of David
mm,
and stunned by how much it is a human story, even though I agree with you, he is larger than life. There's some things where it feels like he's a mirror to our humanity, not simply a kind of some portrait of what we might aspire to.
mm,
And so I just began to read the story as I prepared to preach on it through the lens of how does he is he a companion on the journey, in a sense, both in terms of how he might inspire me, but how he might warn me of certain paths not to go down or behaviors not to cultivate.
mm,
After I decided to write the book, I also steeped myself in the secondary literature on David. As a pastor, I did that as well, but even more in the last 10 years I've been a professor, I've read a lot of the secondary or scholarly literature, and that's been helpful.
mm. It's an interesting point that you make because our tendency is to flatten characters in the Bible, to simplify them to a tagline, to a byline, and yet part of your process in preparation for this was to resist that, to fight against that, and to see all the various dimensions of who he was. What was it that surprised you most? I mean, as a pastor, you must have known about David. You have cultural kind of instincts about David, and there's been many treatments of him. What was it that surprised you that you either didn't know or an angle that you hadn't considered before when you took that deep dive?
I think the David and Goliath story is legendary, and becomes iconic. And yet we see this kind of this struggle of within David's humanity in that story itself. So David comes, to he's summoned or sent by his father to bring bread and cheese or whatnot to the warriors. He's not on the battlefield himself, but when he gets there, he sees a situation, 40 days it's gone, where this giant Goliath taunts the armies of Israel. And David's three of his older brothers, are on the battle line for Israel. And he comes in, he asks one question over and over, repeatedly: what will be done for the man who slays this giant?
Hmm.
And Robert Alter, who's a remarkable Hebraist, his sort of feel for the Hebrew language is extraordinary. Alter's now, I think, 90 years old, but his life work is really, he just completed a couple of years ago the entire translation of the Old Testament in a idiom that's a little captures the texture a little more of the Hebrew language than some of our other translations.
Hmm.
And he has this insight in one of his other books, Robert Alter, and he calls it the law of first mention. And the idea is that in biblical narrative, Old Testament narrative, the the way character development works is the very first thing that pops out of somebody's mouth is extremely significant in terms of what the author of that portrait is telling us about the character of that person.
Hmm.
And the very first thing that comes out of David's mouth is self-interest. What
Hmm.
will be done for the person who kills him? And again, the repeated, it's just repeated. And so that was stunning because I think that I had, even though I was well familiar with the Davis story, I had sort of, embraced or had not really examined the popular idea that David at the Goliath story is just all pure, humble servanthood, and this person who is the one lone one in all Israel who has just sort of the courage and the pluck,
Hmm.
the daring do to go up against the giant and whatnot. But the story itself indicates that there's a deep struggle for self-glory, a deep struggle for personal advantage,
Hmm.
et cetera, going on there. Well, that was super interesting as an author, because an author cares about ambiguity. A
Hmm.
preacher maybe not.
Hmm.
So as a preacher, I want sort of I
Three
want to,
points.
yeah, and I want to arrive at some fairly
Yeah.
conclusive moment that I can then, on the basis of exhort my congregation, be
Right.
like David, fight giants, whatever it happens to be. But a novelist loves ambiguity.
Hmm.
The sense where what we've glimpsed here is a human being caught up in the dynamic of both heroism and self-interest at one and the same time.
Hmm.
That's what makes a character interesting.
Hmm.
That's why we watch, a Netflix show or something. We get bored very, very quickly with the person of pure virtue. We
Hmm.
want something complicated about them. So that was, I mean, there's many discoveries, but that was one of them that I think this struggle goes back to the earliest portrait of David, and then I think it starts to accelerate throughout his life. So then we see this tussle, this wrestling that goes on between, I want to do that which is self, uh, self-giving. I want to give myself over for the sake of serving the nation, serving, other people, serving the purposes of God. I'm fulfilling the purposes of God in my generation. That's what Peter says about David. But there's other part that, no, I want to get mine, and I
Hmm.
want to get it here, and I want to get now, which is again a
Wow.
human condition thing, right?
Yeah. If anybody has ever either pastored or led worship or been on stage at any point in time in their life, they understand that concept of mixed motivation.
Yeah.
I think we come to terms with that, or at least come face to face with it at a really young age. Even when I was leading worship at camp and teaching at a young age, there is a part of you that truly does want to make a difference, wants to be faithful to what God wants you to do. But there are these ghosting voices in the back of your head, or instincts you may not be aware of, that are very focused on what you look like, what other people are saying, how they're responding. And it's this like really uncomfortable marriage between mixed motivations about how you should feel and how you do feel. And I'd never even considered that. In fact, when you were saying that about David's story, I'd completely forgotten that that was one of the kind of bylines in that story about who David was and what he was interested in. So I've read it like a preacher myself far too much, it
Right.
seems.
Yeah, and so well said what you just said, the way you articulated that, Chris. That to me, again, when I say that what I think kept pulling me into the Davis story and became even more compelling as I've been writing these books is this intersection of his story with my story, with the human story,
Mm,
of these conflicting motivations. And you can't collapse it one to the other. Some of the really bad scholarship on David wants to sort of say all of that stuff about his virtue is just PR, it's hype.
mm,
It's propagandistic. It's the David the King David Report. There's a famous book by the German novelist called the King David Report, and it's the whole idea behind it, the premise of that book is that every David was a villain, and all of that villainy got suppressed in the official report,
mm,
suppressed, and the there's the sort of the final composition was hailing him as this great virtuous heroic person. But that's a caricature. The reality is we get a biblical portrait of somebody with these mixed motives, and it's exactly right. I mean, every time I've got up to preach, I've wanted to serve God and the people, and I've wondered if people would like me better
right.
when I was done.
Yeah. And it's not something you can even really prepare for because there's a such a fundamental element inside of you. And every once in a while I look at the kind of Christian church around me and I wonder that God ever gets anything done with us. I mean,
Totally.
I
And
just yeah.
and how hopeful it is for
Yes.
any of us to think,
Yes.
and yet God deemed him a man after his own heart,
Mm,
knowing all of this flawed humanity that was at work throughout his lifetime.
mm,
At the very end, the last portrait we have of David is this one moment he's telling Solomon, follow God all the days of your life and don't depart from a jot or tittle of the
mm.
law and of the virtuous ways of God. And the next thing he puts a hit out on one of his old enemies, right?
Yeah.
And he's like, he goes from sort of this pious, kind of reverent kind of worship leader to this, mafia don,
Right.
basically, right? That's all in one breath. And the Bible doesn't flinch from portraying
Yeah.
these two sides of David
Mm,
right from beginning to end. And so this is compelling to me. Not that we don't see some significant moral advance or moral failing along the way, but it's really does seem to me that there's nothing outside of the portrait of Jesus, the most compelling biblical portrait of a human life is the story of
mm.
David.
Wow. And I mean, so much of the Old Testament narrative is devoted to David. So much of the
Yeah.
Old Testament, even the prose and the Psalms. And I think that whole concept of a warrior poet, I think is just a profound thought, like somebody who is on the battlefield, an absolute victor, but also someone who could write, like Psalm 51 is some of the most moving,
Mm.
repentant prose in all of Scripture. I just preached on that recently, and I was just struck by how moving some of those images are and how heartfelt they are. And it's almost it just kind of blows me away that the same David could go and make such a mess of Uriah's life and such a mess of Bathsheba's life, and then once he's face to face with God afterwards, write something so seemingly deep and moving as that.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. And I think that's what continues to draw us 3,000 years later
Mm,
to his story is what you said at the beginning, this man of contradictions,
mm,
um, that does, I'm suggesting, intersect with our own life, but because of the bigger than life quality, it just more mesmerizing in
yeah.
some ways.
Higher climbs, higher falls, it seems,
Yeah.
for David. I often wonder, too, that sometimes the kingly portraits in the Old Testament, very few of us really understand what it would have been like to be king. I mean, we may have some of the amenities that they have, and with technology, maybe provided with some of the things that they would only dream of. But when you were king, the simplest of wishes and whims that you had would be enacted, and
Yeah.
anybody who says anything you didn't like, you could have them murdered and be above the law at any point in time, by and large. And I think some of us are protected by the legal system that surrounds us. It's almost like when you are king, who you really are comes out in spades, both the beautiful and the ugly too.
So well said. And especially we're talking late Bronze Age, early Iron Age king.
Mm,
So even though we're used to that kind of behavior, even into even the Renaissance period of kingship, or maybe beyond, this
mm,
sort of this divine prerogative of king, this sort of freedom to do whatever you want that can't be touched by law or morality. That's even more so when you go back to, basically you're a chieftain
mm,
in the early Iron Age, and violence is the way
mm,
things get resolved. Um, if you you add that cultural dynamic
mm,
to the extraordinary reach and power you have as a crowned royal, regal.
mhm,
Yeah, I think that makes it all that much more interesting. In terms of what it actually makes interesting is these moments of utmost humility and restraint
mm.
on the part of David.
Yes.
That's where I think that we don't fully understand or give credit to.
Mm,
Even these, like you mentioned, Psalm 51, that comes out of the confrontation that the prophet Nathan has,
mhm,
where finally he says, "You're the guy who did all this things that's so profoundly offensive to God."
mm.
Well, David could have simply
Yeah.
offed Nathan at that point.
Mhm,
Instead, he goes into this profound, and that's both in the narrative of David, Second Samuel. We're told about how he grieves this crime and sin he's committed, and then it gets captured in this beautiful poetry of Psalm 51, where we get the portrait of the inner life of the penitent.
mm,
This is stunning in
mm.
given the cultural milieu in
Yes.
which this is all happening. This is unheard of. And so to give David his due, and to sort of say, yes, he messed up in ways that are abhorrent. He rose to something several times throughout
Mm,
his life, and certainly throughout this long 40-year kingship,
mm,
that really does predict and foreshadow the Christ.
mm,
There's something Christ-like about his humility, Christ-like about his willingness to kind of restrain this really otherwise tyrannical power at his
mm,
beck and call for the sake of serving the nation, serving others, um, becoming a broken person, deeply, deeply longing to restore the relationship with God.
mm. Yeah, I can't help but think too of his encounter with Saul in the cave. Like,
Yeah,
if he had any right of anyone, it would be then to take Saul's life.
yeah,
And yet he just cuts a corner off the robe as he's relieving himself and he crawls back in. And again, you're right. It's just one of those shining moments. And he could have very easily taken his life, but he chose not to.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, so many of those. When he mentions where he's battling the Philistines, I'm thirsty, and some of his mighty men go in and break into a Philistine camp and bring him back water, and he pours it out, not as a sign of disdain, but of honoring these men who have risked their life for him.
Hmm.
He refuses to sort of benefit from his exalted status, but instead stands in solidarity with these men.
Hmm.
These are just these moments where you think, okay, there's something going on with David that truly did transcend his historical cultural moment,
Hmm.
and made him great in a way that continues to speak to us in the 21st century. What true greatness might look like, what
Hmm.
true humility might look like.
And like you said before, too, it's inspiring that the Bible is as honest as it is about our heroes. that we as broken human beings follow a Christ who is perfect, but the 12 disciples were every bit as messed up as we are, it seems, and made every
Yeah.
bit as many mistakes. And same with the heroes of the Old Testament. They weren't shielded from this almost in any way as well. So I think you're right. You said it before, but it gives you hope that God can do something still remarkable in and through you if he can do it through David and through
Yeah.
the 12.
Yeah.
So this discussion, all it brings up for me is the modern crisis that we're experiencing right now in Christian leadership. I don't know if I mean you'd have to be living under a rock with no access to the internet to not know how many Christian leaders over
Hmm.
the last, I say few years, I know that this has been an epidemic for decades, but over the last 5 years, I can name off just dozens of people that I used to look up to. I'm
Hmm.
not an old man yet, but I've been in ministry for 15 years or so now, and I think of guys like Mark Driscoll. I looked up to Mark Driscoll a lot. I know his failure was not the same as some of the others, but I looked up to guys like Rob Bell,
Hmm.
who doesn't even consider himself. If he considers himself a Christian, he doesn't go to church. He's really kind of in a really unique lane. I'm a Canadian. If you're a Canadian, you know of Bruxy Cavey. Like, I mean, I could sit here for Ravi Zacharias. Like, I could sit here
Hmm.
for a long time and just name off names that actually aren't just newspaper articles, but are like kind of nails in the storyboard of my life. And each and every one of them is a kind of story of a catastrophic failure or loss. And so it seems to me there's a crisis of leadership right now in the church, not just in the number and quality, but in the falling of its leaders. Is there anything that we could learn from David, or is there anything from your deep dive into the character of David and the story of David that would shed some light on either A, how or why we got here and why these things are happening, or B, how we might find a way out?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the story of David is a story of what a human does with power.
Hmm.
He moves from a place of utter powerlessness to almost in his world unlimited power. And in a lot of ways, the journey of faith is a journey of navigating what do I do as I attain power.
Hmm.
Um, and the story of Jesus is no question a story of what ultimate power looks like in the service of others, in the service of God. So Jesus relinquishing not power, but relinquishing the privileges of power repeatedly. So the heart of, in some ways, the gospel story is Paul probably riffing on a hymn, but or a creed of the early church, and Philippians 2.
Hmm.
Let your attitude be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, instead humbled himself, etc. So it's really a story, Philippians 2, of what happens to, the story of the God who comes among us with ultimate power,
Hmm.
who chooses what the theological word, this kenosis, this self-emptying of not using that power in some kind of acquisitive, oppressive, coercive, a self-protective way, but quite the opposite. And we see this over and over in the story of Jesus. Mark 10, when the disciples are arguing about who's greatest, and he
Hmm.
pulls them aside and says, the rulers of the Gentiles, how they lord it over, they're gaining power to lord it over. They want to use all that power for their own gain. Not so with you. With you, you must become servant of all, et cetera, et cetera. Um, Jesus washing the feet. And actually, John 13, John sets that story up with Jesus knowing all power was under him, and that he was come from the Father, returned to the Father, takes off his outer robe, bows down and washes his feet. So we're explicitly in John's gospel getting a portrait of what Jesus does with ultimate power. He
Hmm.
uses it for the act of ultimate servanthood. Could be actually that Paul is riffing off of John 13 when he writes Philippians 2.
Hmm.
Anyhow, you're a preacher. You know all of these texts and more that really kind of give us these stunning moments of the all-powerful God
Hmm.
using power in ways that are um, self-sacrificing for
Hmm.
the sake of the not just the other, but the people often at the most. at the fringes, at the margins, who never ever experience a powerful person noticing them, caring for them, giving anything
Mm,
to them. So this is a deep narrative of Christianity. This is a deep ethic, and I think that this the real scandal of what's been happening historically, but certainly we've seen it, I think, accelerate in the last number of years, is that narrative somehow got lost. And I think
mm,
it's got lost at a macro scale and in a micro scale.
mm,
If I could just venture, risk being a bit political here, I think the grasping after cultural political power of the church in North America, and maybe more tellingly, or more obviously in American Christianity, is the exact opposite of the gospel story. That
mm,
we it's not that we don't have power or attain power, but we steward it very, very differently
mm,
than what we would expect in from Jeff Bezos or something.
mm. Isn't that interesting? I remember Andy Stanley was talking once. He's had a few extraordinary honors in his career, and he was once invited after Barack Obama was inaugurated. There's a small little chapel service right off Capitol Hill after the major things, or just before, happen. There's a short little church service that they have, and he was invited once to come and speak. And he had like something like 13 minutes. I forget what it was. And the whole message that he felt like he should give Barack Obama, which I have no idea where Barack Obama's faith is or not, and I don't even know if you can take that from their statements as a politician, anyways. But he preached his whole message on this central question: what do you do when you look around the room and realize you're the most powerful person there? What do you do when you look around the room and realize that there's nobody in that room with more leverage, more opportunity, more authority, more resources than you? And he's speaking specifically to the
Mm,
president. But how you answer that question is like a fundamental question to
yeah,
Christian leadership.
yeah,
Is what do you do with that power? Do you use it for your own purposes? Do you use it to advance your own image, or do you use it to serve the people underneath you? And just listening to you speak right now, it just seems to underscore the fact that humility isn't just some upper level course in the Christian walk, especially in leadership. It is the foundation.
yeah.
And if
And we should, as leaders, actually, we should be uh, reach, if we're attaining to some ethical perfection, that's actually it.
Hmm.
That there's such a Christ-like use of power that's going to keep us away from adultery, from
Hmm.
from raiding the treasury, all of these things. Those are all good ethical boundaries, obviously, but the foundation of them is this choice I keep making every day, that the more power I have, that means that God has entrusted with me with more influence to give things away,
Hmm.
to be there for those people on the margins. And coming to the Davis story, he's at his most magnificent when he does that.
Hmm.
He's at his most despicable when he doesn't, and he's at his most interesting when he's caught between it.
Hmm.
Like the David and Goliath story, where
Right.
he's about to serve all Israel, in this this self-risking, self-giving act, going out there just as himself, no weaponry other than what he uses in the sheepfold, and yet asking this very self-interested question, what's in it for me?
Hmm.
That actually makes him interesting and fascinating, because of that ambivalence or ambiguity in it. But we catch him on all sides of that, when he's at his best, when he's at his worst, and when he's just being like you and I, serving, but sometimes the motives aren't
Hmm.
entirely clear to himself or pure.
Absolutely. No, that's absolutely fascinating. That whole dialectic, that torn kind of mixed motivation happening for each and every one of us. Of all the David stories, was there one that stuck out to you? There was the David and Goliath. Was there another one that just
Yeah, you
captured
know
your
what
attention?
has been capturing for a while, and it became even more interesting as I wrote book two, actually, which is again just coming out. It's called David Rain. The story of Ishbi-Benob, who's the second giant that David fights when he's now aging. He's probably well into his 40s when he fights his second giant. It's a little piece of miscellany at the very end of Second Samuel.
Hmm.
It's part of that sort of odds and sods we get. And it's in chapter 21, and it's he's out there fighting the Philistines, and this guy Ishbi-Benob, sons of Rapha, so he's a giant, comes along and he's going to kill David, and Abishai, um, one of his nephews, come to his rescue. And what's fascinating about it is it's another giant story, but doesn't go the way the Goliath story. David's
Hmm.
getting his is taking a pummeling and has to be rescued.
Hmm.
Virtually nobody knows this story. Even
Yeah.
preachers don't
I
know
can
this story.
I'll be honest, I can barely remember that. I
Yeah.
can't believe that, but I can barely remember
So
that.
look at it, because what's fascinating about it is it seems to me that we prefer and make iconic the story of
Right.
this individual in this act of total heroism, goes and rescue, faces a big giant, saves the day, all that sort of stuff, and have completely forgotten. And the Bible itself seems to tuck away into this forgotten corner of the Bible this story of another giant battle that doesn't go so well, that
Hmm.
David has to be rescued. I would contend that the second story of needing to be rescued from a giant is actually closer to most of our reality. And
Hmm.
but that's a humbling, even humiliating story. I
Yeah.
was I was going to get my backside kicked today. I was going to get my, head held up by the hair by somebody who had severed it from his body,
Hmm.
but somebody came and rescued me. And
Wow.
that story we don't like. And so
No.
that the other thing that became fascinating is I researched it. Ishbi Benob, the name of this giant, means he was raised in Nob. Now Nob is a town of the priests that was burned down and all the priests killed. And I speculate in my novel that this guy has a particular hate on for David, because it may be that the way Philistia fulfilled its obligation, if you kill, our giant Goliath way back in the day, will be your slaves. And I speculate that they assigned the family of Goliath, and most people, scholars, think that Ishbi-Benob was somehow extended family to Goliath. So
Wow.
I think Philistia, um, um, King Achish, maybe took the family of Goliath, extended family, as punishment, actually make them slaves in Israel. I think Ishbi-Benob ended up serving the priests of Nob, was spared in the killing of that thing, but has nursed a grudge against David his whole life. So
Wow.
all of that stuff, sort of emerged into kind of vivid color. So I have this scene near the end of book 2 where I really play out. I really take my time and slow down for this moment when Ishbi-Benob is about to kill David, and he tells him, I've had this lifelong fascination with you because basically you ruined my life, and
Hmm.
now I'm going to get vengeance for myself and all my family.
Wow. I
Yeah.
I'm embarrassed that that's all fresh for me, but that's incredible.
Well, and it really preaches. But by the way, it's fresh for most people.
Hmm.
I teach in seminary, and when I bring up the story, maybe one, maybe sometimes two of my students have ever even heard of it, let alone done anything with it.
And I mean, what a telling story to bookend, or at least to some degree bookend the story of David and Goliath,
Yeah,
because how many of us today would that's probably the biggest probably lesson we need to hear is that in order to triumph, we need community.
yeah.
Like in order for us to be successful, there are times where God will call you to advance and to put your courage on the line and to step forward. And there are other times where you will be saved by the strength of those you cultivated relationships around you.
Entirely. A better story, that second. The first one is David needs nobody,
Hmm.
no one. And I think that actually becomes a bit of the
Interesting.
arc of his life, that he really never needs anybody. And therefore, David, who starts in this fierce, as a young man, fierce independence, ends up in deep, deep loneliness and aloneness at the end of his life.
Hmm.
There's there's nobody actually at the end of David's life that sings a lament for him.
Hmm.
David sings a lament for Saul. David even laments the old killer Abner, the uncle of Saul, and basically he's, Abner's the Joab is henchman, Saul's henchman. David laments these men, and nobody stops to lament David.
Hmm.
And I think partly it's just like he is so alone at the end. And
That's
so yeah, and so in a lot of ways I think that there's these deep themes at work in the story of David that I try to bring out and I try to give some life to and build into the sort of the whole narrative of his life in the retelling of his story through these novels.
wow. That is heartbreaking to
Yeah,
think that a man of such historical and religious and faith significance as David, there's no one there to lament him.
no one.
That's that
It's just
hurts. I
it's
don't
the
know. That
vultures
hits me.
it does it. I mean, I wept when I realized that the vultures are circling. It's all about who gets to be the next king.
Mm,
There's even Nathan ends up in the conspiracy toward the succession of the next king. He seems to be in cahoots somehow with Bathsheba around putting Solomon. If you actually read,
mm,
the source material,
right.
and nobody notices. They're kind of just wishing the old man died
Hmm.
so they can get on with it. And so it was tragic and heartbreaking. It's very hard. I've now starting to work on book 3, which is, by the way, David Descent.
Oh,
That's the name of
interesting.
it. And of course, the play on words, that there's a kind of a deep decline
Hmm.
in at every level in David, but there's also a descendant coming that
Ah.
brings real redemption to the story.
Hmm.
But my I've written the last chapter of David Descent because I'm trying to end the entire trilogy on a note that is hopeful.
Hmm.
But the story in the Bible doesn't end on that hopeful note.
Wow. And so sorry, I'm just processing that. Like I'd never really thought of it from that angle, and that's profound. I was always aware of David's relational shortcomings, and it always grieves me. I feel like there are so many heroes of the faith that are failures at home.
Yeah,
I just,
yeah,
as a father, as a husband, it grieves me. And I mean, there's examples of this in contemporary church too, right? You know, some of the most famous preachers on TV are either divorced. I can think of one right now where there was a big deal about it. And, you know, he's in his 80s now, but it nearly cost him his ministry. But there are so many smaller examples too. You probably know pastors whose
yeah.
home life has fallen apart, and yet they're the faithful in and out of the small church here each and every week, always there for everyone else and not their family. It's heartbreaking for me. And I wonder, maybe that's part of the lesson from David too, is to not neglect what happens inside your house, no matter what's happening outside.
Yeah, I think very much that David had these enormous blind spots, and the one had to do with his own sexuality,
Hmm.
and the other with these deepest relationships. And it's interesting, right after the Nathan story, where he confronts David with a little parable about sheep, which is really a confrontation about David's um, not not uh, being satisfied with all that God had given him.
Right.
But it's also a story of his sexuality, his predatory sexuality in the case of Bathsheba. But in so that's in chapter 12, that confrontation of David by Nathaniel. In chapter 14, just a couple chapters later in 2 Samuel, there's another moment where a woman, the wise woman of Tekoa, comes and tells David a little parable. And David does the similar thing he does with Nathaniel. Is like, oh, this is wrong. We need to do something about it. I'm going to do something about it. And she basically says, but you're the man. It's almost a repeat.
Wow.
And what is that story about? It's about broken family. If you go
Wow.
back in Second Samuel, and it's almost like we have these two stories where David has enormous blind spots, first about his sexuality,
Hmm.
and has to have a little parable told about it before it's suddenly somebody joins the dots for him. And the second one is about his complete failure on the home front, and this woman has to kind of out him through this little parable.
Hmm.
And I think I've often thought that that is so true in my own life and leadership, that the blind spots that I have,
Hmm.
often I need to sort of hear it from an angle that I'm nobody. If I get confronted on it, I just get defensive,
Hmm.
and yet somehow it's
Hmm.
these stories that happen that there's some moment of revelation. Oh my goodness, that is me.
Mm.
I'll give you one example. I remember a time in my marriage where I wasn't being the ideal husband at home, and I was doing marriage counseling for people, this couple pre-marriage, and I was saying something to them about communication and loving and putting aside your own ego and all of that. And as I'm telling them, the Lord's saying, "And you're the man, and you're the man."
Wow. That wow. I knew a leader of a whole men's organization. I won't say the name. It's a very, very well-known one. And there was a time at which he had spent 3 years traveling, 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 preaching weekends, conferences, and he was driving home from one of these conferences with his wife, and his wife turned to him and said, "I'm gonna leave you." And he had just come from like three. She didn't end up leaving. They managed
Mm,
to work things out. But yeah, what a profound idea. It seems that we all have blind spots, whether in
yeah,
leadership or not. We all have them. And it's almost as if power and leadership, they only magnify those blind spots. By
yeah,
no means do they solve them. So there's this just a profound need for us to work through our own brokenness,
yeah,
and be cognizant of that regardless of how high along the kind
yeah.
of ladder God has placed us.
And in the providence of God, I don't understand why mm, y- Jonathan, that this deep trusting, trustworthy friend, was taken out of the picture for
Mm.
David. Because one of the
Ah,
things um, that just the story kind of invites us to ponder is, what would David's life have been like if he had have had Jonathan through the entire
hmm.
arc of his life?
Someone to speak past his
Yeah,
lies. Yeah.
totally. Yeah, and name them, and somebody he could go to and entrust the deepest, darkest stuff of his heart to.
Hmm.
I remember once talking about this in a sermon, and somebody came up to me after, and they kind of summed up what I'd said better than I'd said it. They said, "I think if we have a Jonathan in our life, we'll never need a Nathan."
Wow, that's good.
Yeah.
Sorry, just it's given me a lot to think about. There's so much more depth here than I had really realized about the David story, and
Mm,
I think his humanity is really speaking to me now as we're talking, and I'm just processing it all. And yeah, that's a fascinating question. What in the world would have happened if he had Jonathan with him
yeah.
still? And it just highlights the need that we all have, especially if there's times that we're out of step with the people around us. Is it someone who can tell us what's really the truth? Someone who can be honest with us instead of yes men, instead of people who get their paycheck from you, who will live or
Yeah.
die based on what you say. Someone who has a long enough history with you to call you on your stuff,
Yeah.
and keep you accountable. That's absolutely fascinating.
Hmm.
Huh. Um, I guess maybe just a final question. What was it like trying to invent conversation? Like there's this taboo, right? There's this
Yeah.
taboo about scriptural reenactment. We do this all the
Yeah.
time. We have some really gifted drama like actors, directors, writers here at our church, and they'll reconstruct both biblical kind of conversation and extra biblical conversation. What was it like to try and imagine those conversations? Did you take any heat for
Yeah, taking heat. I mean, if you look at the reviews, those who are much more, um, bound to the text as it comes to us are pretty critical of the kind of risks I've taken in terms of portraiture and dialogue. I don't. I mean, I think when you choose to write historical fiction, biblical or otherwise, you have to kind of step into that place where you imagine backstory
Mhm.
and what might have been said. And in some ways, what I think has given me a little bit of an edge or advantage here is that the book's release basically times out with the release of The Chosen, where
Ah,
we have this
yes.
enormous backstory being developed around what might have happened, what might have
Mm,
been said, and all of that. And that's been fairly widely accepted
mm,
by the Christian community and beyond. So I think that's given me a little bit of room to play or maneuver. But
mm,
what it was like is, at first I was terrified. I really was. And if I go back to my early drafts, it's very wooden
mhm,
because I was so constrained by the text as it stood before me. In fact, there's portions where I just copied right out of
mhm.
Bible Gateway or whatever and just dropped it in. And I realized that I was going to write trying to write a history of David, or I was going to write
Right.
a novel about David. And I simply realized I'm going to have to take this risk and try to
Mm,
imagine my way into these scenes, what was going on in terms of motivation, what might have been said apart from what was reported to
mm.
us.
Yeah.
So a couple of things help. One is that one of the greatest works of literary study of the scripture is by Eric Arbach. It's called Mimesis. It's going back to the 60s or 70s that he wrote that. And he described the Old Testament as fraught with background. And what he said is that there's these moments, like we have these extraordinary stories where suddenly these moments of conflict, moments of high drama, and underneath it we know there must have been a lot going on that
Yeah.
led up to it, it came out after it, but all we have is this little glimpse, almost like a blade that catches the light, and that's all you see, but the rest is utter darkness. And he said that what actually makes the Bible more interesting, than almost any other form of ancient literature, is this dynamic of there's more going on here that's being said.
Mm,
That sort of gave me some sense of, okay, I'm going to try to imagine what the other is the Jewish midrash. For
yeah.
centuries, the Jewish practice of imagining what else, how did we get here? What was being said? This has been part of the sacred tradition of how Jewish people have read the Bible. And so it's nothing shocking in
Mm.
terms of Jewish,
Historically.
yeah, historically. It just became, I think, in a more kind of conservative, maybe literal, tendency toward literal interpretations of scripture, that we've become fairly fetishistic or hung up about
Mm.
it has to be exactly this way.
Well, and I think someone from your vantage point, there's an asterisk on the entirety of the dialogue that's extra biblical, and that this is my imagination
Yeah,
of. And by no means am I claiming revelation or
yeah,
authority. This is my
yeah.
imagination. Did you know? Did you know Eugene Peterson at all? I know you guys
I did a
geographically were
little bit. Yeah.
similar.
Yeah. I knew him. I had several conversations. He wrote the foreword to my very first book,
Oh,
etc.
okay.
So
I
yeah.
didn't know that. He was a brilliant guy,
Yeah.
obviously, and had a huge impact on the world and chafed against the same kind of criticism at times for his paraphrase of the
Yeah.
message, right? Just about taking a modernization or at least some theatrical license in his expression of trying to make it more powerful. But he said once as he was kind of compiling his whole paraphrase, what is that the scripture comes to us dehydrated. This was kind of his image that he used.
Oh, lovely.
Scripture comes to us in a dehydrated form. And as preachers, and he was kind of imagining himself in that role in
Yeah.
the paraphrase, it's our job to rehydrate it with the sights and the sounds and the smells. So it may
That's
be,
fabulous. Yeah.
yeah, it may be a market scene, where it talks about the disciples in the market, and we hear that as a single byline, but it's our job as preachers and writers to rehydrate that text and to add in the sounds and the cacophony and the smells and the tension and the sweat and just all of the things that are there, but the scripture doesn't take time to do that
It's
because it's
brilliant. It's a
coming to
brilliant
us
image.
like
Well,
that.
I'm thinking about, backcountry people, hikers, they bring
Absolutely.
dehydrated food. It's light, it packs easy, but you don't eat it that way.
No.
You To make it nourishing, to make
Yeah.
it filling,
Palatable.
you have to hydrate it, palatable. That's a brilliant image. I think it's all there, all the ingredients are there,
Hmm.
but it is not yet at a form that we can actually digest.
And
And I think that
emotionally
is it.
identify
Yeah,
with. Yeah.
that is, I think, the work. And I think that's what's made the chosen so
Mm.
compelling,
Hmm.
is this kind of that, we know that this is taking liberties with, the story of the woman at the well or whatever,
Mm.
but it seems true to the sort of the character of Christ,
Mm.
to what we know about the cultural moment, it doesn't seem a violation or imposition on the
Mm.
text as we have it. It's just so much more than the bare bones of the text as we have it.
Yeah, and the aim of it is for edification.
Yeah,
The aim of it is not for replacement. The aim is for like encapsulating emotion. Really, I think more than anything is to touch us emotionally, and I think that's a beautiful and a powerful aim. So, yeah.
yeah.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for joining me today. This conversation has given me a lot to think about, and I'm sure for our readers too. So excited for the work you're doing here and for what you have planned for the future. You mentioned that there was a writing project that you were
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
seeding at this point in time.
Yeah, I'm actually well into it, and I'm about three quarters finished another novel, and it's also an historical novel, but this one is based on a village in France, tiny little village that rescued about 2,500 Jews during World War II.
Hmm.
And driven by their Christian faith, it was a Protestant pastor by the name of Andre Tlachme, his wife Magda, that mobilized this village and then the villages beyond to do this heroic, risky, costly thing of welcoming refugees, mostly Jews, into their community and then hiding them, transporting them to safety, mostly in Switzerland. I've been fascinated by the story for a long, long
Hmm.
time, and I've gone 3 times now to this little community,
Wow.
spent time, done interviews, etc. So the book's called Shelter Me,
Hmm.
and I'm hoping it's out in about a year,
Okay.
year or two, year and a half. Yeah.
That's so exciting. I can't wait to read it. That sounds like an absolutely fascinating story.
Thank you. Yeah, it is utterly fascinating, and it's kind of re-inspired my faith in what a small community
Hmm.
motivated out of Christian faith could do. And I think it really speaks to the moment now because this is a group that did transcend the political
Yeah.
passions on all sides, not just the Nazism, but the nationalism of
Hmm.
virtually it was at work in every single country in that time,
Hmm.
and they transcended that for the sake of something, well, actually for the kingdom of God.
Hmm.
So I think it really is a timeless message
Hmm.
and a timely message.
And to leverage their power coming full circle for the least of these.
Absolutely. And
Huh.
and some of them lost their lives because of it.
Wow.
Nobody ever gave up the secret in that community.
That's stunning. I can't
It
wait.
is. Yeah.
Can't wait, Mark. Well, hey, thanks so much for joining me. It's been a fabulous conversation. Look forward to more in the future.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Chris. Bless you.
You too.